Amid the sands of the ancient Middle East, stories were whispered around campfires, passed down from generation to generation long before any book was written. Men looked up to the sky and, without knowing exactly who was listening, cried out for answers. And among the many names used to address the divine, there was one that appeared with a singular force: Yahweh. The curious thing is that this name appears in contexts prior to the founding of the nation of Israel. This raises a question that few dare explore. Was Yahweh already known, revered, and invoked long before Israel existed as a people? The answer is straightforward. Yes, there is strong evidence, both biblical and historical, that Yahweh was recognized as an active, personal, and powerful deity by people outside the Israelite lineage, long before Moses or the prophets raised their voices in his name. This discovery changes the way we understand God's role in human history. It reveals that the search for the eternal did not begin with a single tribe, but crossed eras, peoples, and cultural borders. This is not a God confined to a territory, but a presence that has always manifested itself to anyone who sincerely seeks it. The question of God's name has more weight than it might seem at first glance. In ancient times, knowing the name of a deity meant having some type of access or relationship with it. It was more than a designation. It was a door to a bond, a way of revealing identity, essence, and purpose. So, when we find references to the name Yahweh in texts as remote as the first chapters of Genesis, something within the biblical narrative expands. We no longer speak of a God who only revealed himself to Moses in the desert, but of a presence that has accompanied humanity since long before. Traditional theology teaches that God has always existed. The question here is, to what extent had he already made himself known? When Moses hears the voice coming out of the burning bush and asks, "What is the name of the one who sent him?" the answer is enigmatic. "I am that I am." The answer not only affirms eternal existence, but also presents a name that carries an existential and divine depth in itself: Yahweh. However, if we pay attention to the biblical text, we notice that this name does not appear there for the first time. He is already present in Genesis, centuries before Moses was born. This detail often goes unnoticed because we are used to reading the biblical narrative as a linear sequence of revelations. However, when you observe carefully, you realize that Yahweh was invoked by characters who preceded the patriarchs. In the 4th chapter of Genesis, there is a moment when, after the birth of Enos, son of Seth, the text states that it was then that men began to call on the name of the Lord. In the original Hebrew text, the word used there is YHWH, YHWH. How is this possible? Of the revelation of this name, according to the traditional narrative, would only come much later. This is one of the keys that opens his understanding to something greater. Knowledge of God was not restricted to one lineage, one language, or one culture. The Creator was present from the beginning, responding to sincere voices, revealing himself to hearts that sought him even without fully understanding who he was. The most surprising thing is to realize how this divine presence, despite being revered by different names, carried common traits in several ancient traditions. Monotheism, for example, is an idea that many imagine originated exclusively with the Hebrews. However, records such as the hymns to Aten in ancient Egypt or references to the Most High God among Semitic peoples suggest that the perception of a single creator God was not completely foreign outside the Israelite tradition. This point does not reduce the importance of biblical revelation, but expands it. It means that God did not wait for a specific people to begin acting. He manifested himself wherever there was space to be heard. Throughout the pages of history, we see people emerge who, from different origins and contexts, developed a true faith in something greater. Not all of them knew the name. Not all of them had the right words, but many recognized the same invisible presence that would later guide Israel in the desert. It is in this intertwining of ancient voices, forgotten cries, and preserved names that we begin to understand the depth of what the name Yahweh means. A name that resonates not as a creation of a culture, but as a reflection of a greater reality. God was never absent, even when men were still trying to name him. And the fact that this name appears in contexts prior to the history of Israel does not contradict biblical faith, but strengthens it. It indicates that the alliance with a people was part of a broader plan, not its absolute beginning. It is possible, then, that the true history of the name Yahweh does not begin with Moses, but with the first people who looked up to the sky and, without knowing exactly what they were saying, called out to the Creator. Because where there is honest searching, there is room for revelation. And it is along this path that the script begins to unfold, between ancient voices and sacred names, in a journey that still invites those who listen to it to ask themselves, since when did we know the God who reveals himself as Yahweh? The name Yahweh, which carries with it a unique divine identity, did not appear for the first time on the lips of Moses at the burning bush. Even though that moment is remembered as the formal revelation of the name to the people of Israel, the oldest records of Scripture point to something earlier, something that defies traditional chronology. In the 4th chapter of Genesis, long before the emergence of Abraham or the formation of the tribes of Israel, the text states that men began to call on the name of the Lord. The word used there in the original Hebrew is the tetragrammaton YHWH, the oldest recorded form of the name Yahweh. This detail is not accidental. Genesis chapter 4 describes Adam's descendants after the death of Abel and the birth of Seth. At a certain point, Enosh was born, and the biblical account records that it was then that the invocation of the name of the Lord began. It is important to highlight that this event occurs, according to traditional biblical chronological estimates, around the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. That is, more than 1,000 years before Moses climbed Mount Sinai. Throughout Jewish tradition, commentators such as the Masoretes have preserved the use of the tetragrammaton YHWH in sacred texts, recognizing that its presence dates back to the oldest narratives. Even though later copyists avoided pronouncing the name directly, replacing it with Adonai or other titles, the text remained intact in terms of its original spelling. This shows that the name Yahweh was already inserted in the first structures of faith recorded in the Scriptures. Following the biblical timeline, another striking example appears in Genesis chapter 12. At this point in the narrative, we have the call of Abraham, then known as Abram, who, upon arriving in the land of Canaan, builds an altar and calls upon the name of the Lord again. Once again, the Hebrew text uses the tetragrammaton, reinforcing the continuity of use of the name Yahweh by characters who lived well before the covenant established with Moses. What makes this data so significant is the context in which Abraham found himself. He had left Haran, a city in Mesopotamia, around the 19th century BC, driven by a promise that he would be the father of a great nation. Upon arriving in Canaan, his first recorded action is to build an altar and invoke Yahweh. Not a new name, not a newly discovered deity, but a familiar, revered name whose presence was recognized. This points to a previous tradition, inherited, perhaps passed down orally, but already existing. On a careful reading of the narrative structure of the first chapters of Genesis, it becomes evident that Yahweh was not introduced abruptly. Its mention is recurrent, associated with creation, the relationship with the first human beings, and the guidance of the generations that came after. This is not a theological concept inserted late, but a divine identity rooted in the first records of biblical faith. Even though the full understanding of who Yahweh was developed over time, his presence as a central figure was already established. This observation raises an interesting possibility. Knowledge of the name Yahweh may have been passed down through spiritual lineages that resisted the widespread corruption of the ancient world. In a scenario where idolatry grew and regional gods took shape, there were still men and women who kept the knowledge of a unique, personal, and eternal God. This explains why figures like Abraham, even outside the institutionalized Israelite environment, were familiar with this name. He was not discovering Yahweh, but rediscovering a name that was probably part of his spiritual heritage. In the historical context of the ancient Near East, where local deities received names linked to natural, tribal, or territorial functions, the name Yahweh stands out. It was not associated with sun, rain, fertility, or war, as was common in the Mesopotamian or Canaanite pantheons. Yahweh was a name that spoke of existence in itself, of an absolute being, present before everything and beyond everything. This aspect separates him from other deities and gives the biblical tradition a profound originality, that of a God who does not depend on creation to exist who is its source. Linguistic studies reinforce this idea. The name Yahweh is usually associated with the Hebrew verb hayah, which means to be or to exist. This supports the meaning given in Exodus. I am that I am. But if this understanding was already present in the patriarchal ages, then the revelation to Moses was less an introduction and more a confirmation, a powerful reminder of something that was already being whispered in previous generations. Given this evidence, it is possible to affirm that the use of the name Yahweh before Moses was not an error of literary anachronism, but rather a testimony to the continuity of revelation. Yahweh manifested himself since the beginning of humanity, even though many had moved away. The emergence of the nation of Israel, then, does not mark the starting point of true worship, but rather the establishment of a visible alliance with a people who, at that moment in history, were ready to carry that name among the nations. This understanding transforms the way we read Scripture. Instead of a narrow line of revelation, we see a wider network, where Yahweh has always been present. The story of their worship does not begin on a mountain with stone tablets, but on ancient altars, in voices that cried out in the silence and in hearts that searched, even without knowing all the details, for the one who is, who was, and who will always be. While observing the emergence of the name Yahweh in times long before Sinai, a mysterious character appears in the Scriptures and completely breaks with the idea that the revelation of the true God was confined to a specific lineage. This character is Melchizedek. Little is said about him, but enough to provoke deep reflections on the scope of divine action outside the borders of Israel. The only direct mention of Melchizedek in the book of Genesis appears in chapter 14. At that moment, Abram, even before receiving the name Abraham, returns from a battle against kings from the east. He had rescued his nephew Lot and recovered the looted goods of the city of Sodom. Upon returning, he is surprised by an unusual figure, a king who also performs a spiritual function. Melchizedek is presented as ruler of Salem, a city identified by many scholars as ancient Jerusalem and priest of the Most High God. He brings bread and wine, blesses Abram in the name of this God, and in response, Abram gives him a tenth of everything he had conquered. This episode, although brief, is full of theological implications. First, the identity of the God that Melchizedek represents is revealed by the expression Most High God, Creator of heaven and earth, a title that in Hebrew is El Elyon. This designation is not accidental. Among the peoples of the Fertile Crescent, the use of elevated titles to refer to supreme deities was common. However, the way Melchizedek relates to this God and how Abram responds to his blessing indicate that we are not facing a foreign cult that is irreconcilable with biblical faith. On the contrary, there is clear continuity between the God of Melchizedek and the God of Abram. They recognize the same supreme being. Another significant detail is that Melchizedek appears without a genealogy. There is no mention of his parents nor his lineage. This is rare in Old Testament literature, where descent was an important form of spiritual and social validation. The lack of background suggests that Melchizedek is being presented as someone who represents a spiritual authority independent of the patriarchal or Levitical structures that would be established later. Later, in the book of Hebrews, this characteristic becomes highlighted. The author of the epistle dedicates part of chapter 7 to the figure of Melchizedek, directly associating him with Christ. He describes him as someone without a father, without a mother, without a beginning or end, comparable to the Son of God. The association does not claim that Melchizedek was the Christ, but rather that his priestly function anticipated an eternal and superior model, unrelated to the priestly lineage of Levi. It represents a type of universal eternal priesthood, not limited by future religious institutions. This connection sheds light on how God revealed himself before the law. Melchizedek was not an Israelite, nor was he part of any tribe associated with the Mosaic religion. Still, he served the true God and acted as a spiritual mediator. This shows that divine action was not contained by ethnic or religious boundaries. Yahweh, although called here by another title, was already present in cities outside the history of Israel, being recognized and worshipped by leaders who lived according to his will, even without the support of the law or the promises made to Abraham. Furthermore, Abram's gesture in handing over tithes to Melchizedek is of profound significance. He recognizes a superior authority in that priest. This happens before the formation of the nation, before the tribes, and before the codification of religious norms. Abram, considered the father of faith, spiritually submits to the blessing of a man who represents the presence of God in a foreign city. The narrative, therefore, suggests that Yahweh's presence was never restricted to what would later become the people of Israel. It was manifesting itself among righteous men in unlikely places. It is important to highlight that the name of the city where Melchizedek reigned, Salem, is related to the word shalom, which means peace. The fact that the priest of the Most High God governs a place linked to peace reinforces the idea that his authority was based on values compatible with the divine character: justice, harmony, and reverence for the Creator. This is not a folkloric or symbolic figure, but a concrete example that the relationship with God was possible outside the scope that would be formalized with Israel. When looking at this narrative more closely, it becomes evident that God did not wait for the emergence of a religious structure to begin acting in the world. He already operated through figures like Melchizedek, anticipating spiritual realities that would only be fully understood centuries later. The faith that is expressed through this mysterious priest is a demonstration that the knowledge of God was not the privilege of an exclusive group, but part of a broad, progressive revelation accessible to those who lived with righteousness and fear. This understanding not only expands the perception of Yahweh's reach in history, but also establishes a theological pattern that later resurfaces in the figure of Jesus, whose mission equally transcends tribal, cultural, and religious boundaries. The presence of Melchizedek in the scriptures thus functions as a reminder that the true priesthood is not a function inherited by blood, but recognized by communion with the eternal God, who always spoke to those who sincerely sought him, even when the world did not yet know what to call him. The presence of Melchizedek demonstrates that the relationship with the true God was not limited to Abraham's descendants. This perception becomes even more evident when looking at other biblical figures who, despite being outside the Israelite lineage, demonstrate direct knowledge and reverence for the God known as Yahweh. Among these characters, two stand out for the clarity with which they interact with the divine: Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, and Job, the protagonist of one of the oldest and most enigmatic works of Scripture. Jethro is presented in the book of Exodus as a priest in Midian, a land south of Canaan, inhabited by a nomadic people who had their own religious traditions. He appears in the narrative at a critical moment in Moses' life. After fleeing Egypt for killing an Egyptian, Moses finds refuge among the Midianites, marries one of Jethro's daughters, and spends years as a shepherd under his guidance. It is significant that, even before the divine call on Mount Horeb, Moses was living under the spiritual tutelage of a priest who already served the true God. When analyzing the subsequent meeting between Jethro and Moses, after the liberation of the Hebrew people from Egypt, it is possible to see that Jethro explicitly recognizes Yahweh's action. Upon hearing the report of the wonders performed in favor of the Israelites, he exalts the name of the Lord and declares that Yahweh is greater than all the gods. Furthermore, he offers sacrifices and participates in a banquet with the elders of Israel, a gesture that would not be permitted if he represented a pagan cult. The biblical text does not present resistance to the presence of Jethro. On the contrary, his figure is received with respect, and his wisdom is valued, to the point where he advises Moses on organizing the people, suggesting the creation of auxiliary leaders to judge minor issues. This acceptance demonstrates that Jethro not only knew the name of Yahweh, but had already cultivated a relationship with him before the delivery of the law at Sinai. His spiritual authority was recognized even without a blood connection to Israel. It is possible that the Midianites, descendants of Midian, son of Abraham and Keturah, preserved knowledge about the true God throughout the generations, even amid the influence of other regional cults. This hypothesis, although not explicitly confirmed, helps to understand how Jethro could exercise a legitimate priesthood before the Creator. While Jethro represents the figure of the priest who lived in times parallel to the beginning of Israel's history as a nation, Job transports us to an even more distant era, in a region outside the traditional geographic limits of the Hebrew narrative. The book of Job does not indicate precisely when the events described occurred, but several scholars point to a very early date, possibly between the 19th and 16th centuries before the Common Era. Its place of origin, the land of Uz, was located east of the territory of Canaan, probably in regions close to Arabia or Edom. What draws attention to the story of Job is the theological depth he expresses. Even without being part of the chosen people, he demonstrates a heightened understanding of divine justice, God's sovereignty, and human fragility in the face of suffering. At various times, he refers to the Lord by the name Yahweh, which reinforces his connection with the same God later revealed to Moses. Even more surprising is the fact that this relationship with the divine takes place in a context of pain, loss, and silence, which shows a faith not based on immediate rewards, but on deep convictions. Job is not alone in his search for answers. His non-Israelite friends also discuss topics such as guilt, mercy, and repentance, demonstrating that ideas about God's character circulated outside Israelite circles. The theology presented in the book is rich, questioning, and dense, something that would hardly have developed in a spiritual vacuum. Job's experience reveals that, in ancient times, even outside the Levitical structure, there were already communities where God was known, invoked, and respected. It is important to note that the book does not portray Job as someone who discovers God throughout the narrative. From the beginning, he is described as blameless, upright, and fearing the Lord. His relationship with the Creator is established before the calamities he faces, which reinforces the idea that his spirituality is not circumstantial but the result of a personal and consolidated trajectory. Job offers sacrifices, prays for his children, and intercedes for his friends. He understands, even without the support of a written revelation, that the relationship with God requires reverence, integrity, and trust. Job's testimony also points to prophetic knowledge. At a certain point in his anguish, he declares that he knows that his Redeemer lives, and that, in the end, he will rise on the earth. This statement reveals a vision that goes beyond the limits of his generation and anticipates concepts that would be revealed centuries later. Even surrounded by doubts and contradictions, he keeps hope alive in a personal, just, and redemptive God. Both Jethro and Job show us that Yahweh's knowledge was not restricted to a single people or region. God spoke to those who were willing to listen, even in the shadows of history, far from major events and institutional religious landmarks. These figures reinforce that the presence of God was manifested among those who cultivated fear, righteousness, and sincere search, even if they did not have the lineage or symbols of the chosen people. The presence of Jethro and Job in the scriptures already broadens the view of the scope of divine revelation long before Israel's religious structure was consolidated. But there is a character whose story brings even more complexity to this panorama. His name is Balaam, a foreign seer whose interaction with the God of Israel is direct, constant, and in some ways disconcerting. His role, although surrounded by controversy, offers some of the clearest evidence that Yahweh's voice resonated beyond the borders of the Hebrew people. The scenario in which Balaam appears is described in the book of Numbers. Israel had already left Egypt and was moving towards the Promised Land. During this journey, the approach of the people caused fear among neighboring nations. The king of Moab, Balak, feeling threatened, decides to seek spiritual help to weaken the Israelites. He sends messengers to meet Balaam, a man known for his gift of blessing and cursing effectively. The curious detail is that Balaam lived in Pethor, a city on the banks of the Euphrates River, located in a region that corresponds to current Syria or northern Iraq, far from Israeli territory. Upon receiving the emissaries, Balaam does not make an immediate decision. Instead, consult the Lord. The text reports that God came to Balaam and spoke to him. This expression is used elsewhere in Scripture when describing communication with prophets such as Samuel or Elijah. There is no indication that Balaam was hallucinating or communicating with a strange god. The language used shows that he recognized Yahweh's voice and was used to hearing it. The surprise of the modern reader arises then when realizing that a man outside the people of the covenant received direct instructions from the same God who guided Moses. The dialogue between Balaam and Yahweh is repeated on several occasions. God instructs him not to curse Israel, as those people had been blessed. Balaam, even when faced with promises of reward and prestige, obeys the divine order. When he finally leaves for Moab, he is again warned that he can only say what the Lord allows him. The content of the messages that Balaam utters is revealing. Instead of casting curses, he pronounces blessings on Israel, exalting Yahweh's power, recognizing his uniqueness among the gods, and even proffering a messianic vision by stating that a star will arise from Jacob. This episode reveals that Yahweh's influence was not limited to geography or lineage. He communicated with whoever he wanted, including those who were not formally linked to the history of Israel. Balaam, although not a model of fidelity, functioned as a legitimate communication channel. This reinforces the idea that the relationship with the Creator transcends religious structures and is accessible to anyone willing to listen to him, even if the reasons are not completely pure. The complexity of the figure of Balaam also lies in his moral ambiguity. Although he obeys the divine voice at certain times, he is later remembered negatively in other texts. The book of Numbers suggests that he induced the Moabites to seduce the Israelites into idolatry. The New Testament takes up this accusation, denouncing his greed and lack of integrity. Yet even with these flaws, the fact remains: God chose to speak to him. Revelation was not conditioned on perfection, but on divine sovereignty. This reality sheds light on a principle that permeates the entire biblical narrative. God reveals himself whenever and however he wants, regardless of human categories. He is not subject to institutions, and his voice can reach even those who are on a collision course with his purposes. Balaam's story deconstructs the idea that contact with the divine is restricted to environments considered pure or sacred. On the contrary, it shows that truth can emerge in the midst of conflict, self-interest, and tension between human desire and God's will. A relevant detail in the story is that Balaam, contrary to what many would expect from someone outside the Israelite faith, knows the name Yahweh and uses it when speaking to King Balak. He does not resort to generic titles or other regional gods. His vocabulary and posture indicate that he recognized not only a superior being, but the God himself who led Israel. The use of the sacred name is not treated as usurpation or blasphemy, but as evidence that this name was already known, feared, and respected in regions well beyond the borders of Canaan. Even more intriguing is the content of the prophecies that Balaam delivers. In one of them, he states that he sees, but not up close, contemplates, but not immediately, and then announces the coming of a star and a scepter that will arise from Israel. This statement is considered by many interpreters to be a prophetic reference to the coming of a Messianic king. The fact that this vision comes from someone outside the people of promise reinforces the idea that Messianic hope was already being sown among the nations. God was revealing parts of his plan to diverse individuals, spread out geographically and disconnected from the official line of written revelation. Balaam's trajectory, therefore, is not just that of a man who listened to God. It is the story of how revelation could reach the most unlikely, even in hostile contexts. Yahweh spoke beyond known limits. And even when his words were spoken by inconsistent lips, his purpose prevailed. It was not the reputation of the messenger that validated the message, but the faithfulness of the God who spoke. The way Balaam becomes a spokesman for divine declarations, even without being aligned with the spiritual purpose of the people of Israel, significantly expands the understanding of the reach of God's voice in the ancient world. He was not an example of righteousness, nor a symbol of covenant, but he still had access to truths that surpassed his time. This forces us to revisit the idea that the relationship with Yahweh was limited to a specific nation. On the contrary, the revelation seems to have emerged with varying intensity in different corners of the earth, reaching figures who lived on the margins of the main biblical account. This pattern is not isolated to Balaam. When one carefully observes the structure of the scriptures, from Genesis to the prophetic books, it is possible to perceive a coherent line that points to Yahweh's actions among different peoples. In several passages, God interacts with foreign kings, announces judgments on Gentile nations, and even establishes universal moral principles applicable outside the context of Israel. What emerges throughout these records is the image of a creator who communicates with all humanity, not with ethnic or geographic exclusivity. This perspective aligns with the statement recorded by Paul in his letter to the Romans, where he declares that what can be known about God is manifest among all creation. His invisible attributes have been clearly perceived through created things. The message is simple. God has always been accessible, and his presence has never been limited to the borders of an institutional religion. The signs of his existence, his justice, and his glory have always been spread among the people. This understanding transforms our reading of sacred history itself. The covenant with Abraham, the giving of the law to Moses, and the establishment of the Levitical priesthood. All these milestones are real, profound, and necessary, but they do not represent the absolute beginning of God's activity on earth. They are, in fact, forms of organization of a revelation that was already underway, consolidating a people to serve as a channel between the divine and the nations. Israel's election was not an isolated privilege, but a mission with a global objective. Yahweh's universality is also manifested in the way he responds to all who sincerely seek him. From the first generations, before the formation of any written tradition, there is evidence that people invoked the name of the Lord, moved by genuine faith. These manifestations of spirituality were not linked to temples, tribes, or laws. They were human responses to the silent call of a God who revealed himself to those who desired him. This reality has powerful implications for the present. It dispels the idea that true spirituality only belongs to a group with access to sacred texts or specific traditions. On the contrary, it teaches that the Creator is more interested in the disposition of the heart than in the cultural position. People in different regions, times, and contexts have experienced encounters with the divine, albeit with partial vocabularies, rituals, or understandings. What unites all of these experiences is the response to a call that echoes throughout creation. By recognizing this line of continuity, we realize that figures such as Job, Jethro, Melchizedek, and Balaam are witnesses to this historical process. Each one, in their own way, confirms that the relationship with God does not depend on blood inheritance but on an interior openness. They do not represent exceptions but examples of a greater truth. Yahweh allows himself to be found where there is authentic search, even if the seeker is not within the religious structure formalized by Israel. This pattern of broad revelation also explains why many ancient peoples developed, even if in a fragmented way, notions of justice, sacrifice, eternity, and redemption. These intuitions do not arise by chance. They are traces of the dialogue that God maintained with humanity throughout the ages. When we look at civilizations such as the Egyptian, the Mesopotamian, or the Persian, we notice elements of transcendence that point to something beyond the visible. Even if they did not achieve a complete theology, these people expressed in their own ways the desire to reconnect with something greater. The name Yahweh, in this context, appears as a point of convergence. It is not just one label among many, but the expression of a divine identity that carries within it an essence of eternity, presence, and continuous action. When this name appears in the Genesis narrative, or on the lips of prophets like Elijah and Isaiah, it carries the weight of centuries of divine interaction with humanity. It is not a new name, but a rediscovered name, an old key that opens long-existing doors. Recognizing Yahweh's actions among ancient people helps us see that faith is not a cultural invention, but a human response to the divine. It can be formalized through doctrines and structures, but its essence is prior to any system. God already spoke before the first tablet of stone, before the first temple, and before the first psalm. And he continues to speak, not only among those who know him by name, but also among those who feel him in their consciousness, in their creation, in the silent search for meaning and truth. This broader view rescues the spiritual dignity of people forgotten by the traditional narrative. It reminds us that God was not absent while nations were formed, kings rose to power, or empires crumbled. He was always there, offering guidance to anyone willing to listen. And even when men ignored him, his calling persisted. Because Yahweh's purpose has always been greater than a culture or territory. He continues to be the one who lets himself be known by all who sincerely seek him. The breadth with which Yahweh manifests himself in the pages of Scripture cannot be ignored. The succession of testimonies coming from distant lands, non-Israelite characters, and cultures parallel to the Hebrew tradition reveals something that goes beyond formal religion. The presence of a God who made himself known even before the formalization of any belief system. Each example brought along this trajectory, from the cries recorded in Genesis to the oracles proclaimed by Balaam, pointing to a creator who was never silent or absent from human history. This observation does not reduce the importance of Israel's role as a chosen people. On the contrary, it expands the scope of its mission. The covenant made with Abraham, the delivery of the law on Sinai, and the prophetic call that spanned centuries have as their backdrop the divine desire to reach all nations. What we see then is a continuous process. God organizing, guiding, and summoning a people, not to monopolize revelation, but to become light among others. This process did not begin with Moses, nor with the prophets. One could already discern its roots in men who did not possess the promises but maintained reverence. Men like Job, who even outside the direct line of promise possessed deep spiritual discernment. Priests like Melchizedek as legitimate representatives of the true God. Leaders like Jethro, whose faith was recognized without reservation. Prophets like Balaam, who even under dubious motivations heard and transmitted words that marked generations. All of them are pieces that make up the broader mosaic of divine action among peoples. This narrative invites us to look at spirituality from a new perspective. Instead of imagining that spiritual truth is confined to certain places, structures, or formulas, we are challenged to recognize that it can emerge in unexpected places, in little remembered voices, and in experiences that do not easily fit into our models. Yahweh's history is vaster than the memory of a people. She is the invisible thread that intertwines the oldest human quests with the deepest revelation. Where there was a sincere heart, there was also a chance for divine response. In many moments, this recognition was stifled by religious systems that confused authority with exclusivity. But God himself, throughout the scriptures, demonstrates that he himself has always been beyond cultural and institutional limitations. The criterion he uses is not blood affiliation ut interior disposition. He made himself heard by shepherds in forgotten regions, kings on distant thrones, women in tents, and strangers on obscure paths. In every corner of history, his presence can be traced. This perception changes the way one interprets the journey of faith. It is not limited to formulas opens up to listening. The question is not who can find God, but who is willing to respond when he reveals himself. And revelation, as we have seen, does not respect borders drawn by men. It crosses languages, cultures, and life stories, seeking space in consciousnesses that have not yet been shaped by dogmas, but that instinctively recognize the echo of truth. Faced with this, spiritual responsibility transforms. Knowing that Yahweh revealed himself even before the founding of Israel, and that he continues to reveal himself to those who sincerely seek him, eliminates any claim to religious superiority. Instead of building walls, this understanding invites the building of bridges. He leads us to value experiences of faith that may not share our references, but that bear the mark of a God who has always spoken and who still speaks. The name Yahweh, which in Hebrew refers to absolute existence, remains a symbol of this continuous presence. It is not an invention of an era or a title created by tradition. It is the signature of a being that presents itself as the source of everything that lives. When this name is invoked by Abraham, Moses, Job, or an unlikely prophet in foreign lands, what is recognized there is not just a sound, but a presence, an identity that spans centuries and manifests itself with the same force between nomadic tents and pagan palaces. This panorama reveals that true spirituality is not in the possession of a name, but in responding to the call that that name represents. Yahweh has always been the approaching God. Its history does not begin with a people and does not end with a tradition. It continues through those who listen and respond. And this continuity does not depend on belonging to a group, but on opening your heart to the truth. At the end of the day, it's not about where someone was born or what they inherited. The deeper question is whether the heart is willing to recognize a voice that has always been there. The story of Yahweh is not the exclusive property of those who inherited it, but a living offering for all who choose to walk towards the one who has always been calling. Even in the most forgotten folds of history, he was always there, waiting for an answer.